Chapter 20. A Visit from Mr. Becker. The first thing I saw when I woke up was my volcano sitting next to me on my pillow. It was small enough to fit into the palm of my hand. Not only that, the hole was fixed, and the entire thing had been beautifully decorated. "Wow!" I cried.
"What good is having a shrinking ray if you can't use it to help a friend?" burped Phil.
He was on my nightstand, his pot floating 1/4 of an inch or so above the surface. I could see Plink climbing around inside his branches.
"And wait till you see it erupt," said Tar Gibbons. "We've added a few special effects."
"This is great," I said, hoping their special effects wouldn't convince the police that I was indeed the one who had blown up the Becker place. "It's no more than you have earned," said Madame Pong.
Directive 479.8.4.3.9 of the Galactic Code specifies that those who assist in operations of the GP should be rewarded for their efforts, said Gracker stiffly.
I was delighted to see the little guy up and around again. I carried the volcano to the car before Mum was even awake. Phil flew the Furkle and its enlarge array around to meet us. "I'd suggest we take it to about 85% of the original size," said Snout. "That should make it easier to move around." It fit easily into the trunk. "This is great, guys," I said. "I don't suppose you have any advice for me on how to deal with Arnie?" Madame Pong smiled. "Just go to school and have a good day, Rod," she said. "But," her smile grew even broader, "I can almost guarantee it will be a good day," she said. And that was all I could get out of her. Mum drove me and the volcano to school. The silence in the car was deafening. She didn't speak until we were in the school parking lot. "Rod, about Arnie," she started. "Don't worry," I said, hoping the aliens wouldn't make a liar out of me. "I'll take care of it." I had hoped for some reaction to the volcano when I brought it into the classroom, but people were so wound up talking about the explosion at the Becker house that they barely noticed it. About the only one who said anything was Arnie Markle. He walked over, making a point of showing me the big cast on his hand, and said, "Great volcano, all right. I can't wait to see it go off. Where's that little guy you're supposed to give me?" Before I could answer, the classroom door swung open. To my astonishment, Billy Becker's father, or more precisely the android Billy had used as his fake father, walked in. "Good morning, Mr. Becker," said Miss Maloney nervously. "I was so sorry to hear about the terrible tragedy at your house yesterday afternoon. Is Billy all right?"
"He's fine, Miss Maloney," said Mr. Becker. "I wonder if it would be all right if I addressed the class for a moment."
She furrowed her brow, but then said, "Be my guest."
"Thank you," said the android. Then it turned to face us. "I feel I must apologize to all of you for the things you have suffered at my son's hands over the last several months. He is a very troubled boy. As you know, there was an accident at our home yesterday, and it was destroyed. I have heard some speculation that Rod Albright might have been involved, both because he was out of school yesterday and because he has been making a volcano. This is total nonsense. What happened yesterday was entirely Billy's fault. Let this be a lesson to the rest of you not to play with matches." Furrowing his brow, Mr. Becker walked between the desks until he reached the one where Arnie Markle sat. Leaning over Arnie, he said, "I understand that you were good friends with Billy, that you almost idolized him." Arnie nodded, uncertain of what to say. The Mr. Becker android shook his head sadly. "You must be a very sick and troubled boy. I would suggest that you get counselling immediately. Otherwise it is likely you will end up in the same reform school where we have been forced to send Billy." Arnie turned white. "Furthermore," said Mr. Becker android, turning back to the front of the room, "it should be clear that Wednesday's playground incident, the one in which this young man broke his hand, was entirely the fault of himself and my son, and that Rod Albright is completely blameless in the matter. I have spoken to Mr. Markle and made it clear that Billy has made a statement absolving Rod of all blame. This will be filed with the police." Turning back to Arnie, he added, "Your father has dropped the lawsuit. I do not think that I would want to be you this afternoon." Arnie groaned and slid down in his seat. Turning to me, Mr. Becker winked. Then he strode out of the room. That afternoon, the twins and I went out to Seldom Seen to say goodbye to the aliens. This was the bad part of the day. To my astonishment, I realised that I didn't want them to go. They were full size again, which is to say they stood slightly higher than my navel. "This is fairly standard size throughout most of the galaxy," Madame Pong had told me the night before. "It is one reason that BKR disguised himself as a child on your planet. It was the only way to fit in among people who have this odd tendency towards giantism." I had remembered the time that Snout started to say it could also have something to do with his stat, and Gracker had cut him off. Now I understood that he had been about to say stature. Gracker hadn't wanted me to know their actual size because he felt that it would make them vulnerable. Tar Gibbons was the first to say farewell. Stretching its neck so that it could lean its head on my shoulder, it said, "This is a sad parting for me, young Rod Albright. I honour the warrior spirit within you, and wish that you could travel the stars with us." "Thank you, Tar Gibbons," I said. "I have learned much from you already." I didn't add that over half of it made no sense at all. The half that did make sense was terrific. "For someone made of meat, you are a fine being," said Phil, wrapping one of his tendrils around my shoulder. "I almost feel that you could be one of the family." "Really?" I asked in surprise. "Mostly because you're such a nut," said Phil. I still couldn't tell if he was joking or not. "Train your mind," said Snout, reaching up with his long, spindly arms to grasp my shoulders. After he had held me for a moment, he reached into the pocket of his cloak and pulled out a book. "Here, I had the computer run off a copy in your language last night." I took the book. It was titled Secrets of the Mental Masters. "I'll read it carefully," I promised. Madame Pong was next. "Rod, if it were in my power, I would grant you your heart's desire," she said softly. "Do you know my heart's desire?" I asked, my voice equally soft. She nodded. "You want your father." My throat grew thick, but I forced out the words and asked the question I had been avoiding since yesterday. "Was BKR telling the truth? Does he know where my father is?" "I doubt it very much," she said. "You know why he said that, don't you?" I nodded. To be cruel. In that much, BKR had been successful. I knew I would always wonder if he could really have told me something about my father. Even so, I didn't doubt that I had done the right thing. I think my father would have approved. "Please take this," said Madame Pong, slipping a ring from her pocket. "The stone is from my planet. It is of great value to my heart." I started to protest, to try to give it back to her, but she shook her head and said, "It is the mark of a diplomat to accept a gift with grace." Then she bowed and went into the ship. Gracker was last. He came and stood before me, his head no higher than my armpit. He stared at me for a moment, then raised his hand and made a salute. "Well done, Deputy Albright. Well done indeed." Then he boarded the ship with the others. I took the things by the hands and we backed away. With a rumble, the Furkle lifted from the ground. An orange ray shone through one of the FD gizmos and the ship began to shrink. Soon it was the same size it had been when it landed in my papier-mâché. Suddenly it shot straight up. In less time than it takes to tell, it disappeared into the sky. I stared after it for a long time, then still holding the things by the hands, I imitated the Furkle and headed for home. Life would be easier without the aliens around, but if I told you I wouldn't miss them, you would know that I was lying.